Hi, we continue in Genesis 7 in the flood story, which begins here in verse 11 like this. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Some of this story might sound familiar, and certainly the idea of it raining 40 days and 40 nights has become proverbial. Every time there's a big rainstorm, we probably hear some echo of that, just like in my Books of Samuel series, we hear David and Goliath all the time. But what would that really mean? So I want to take a step away from what we've been doing a little bit in the previous videos, and you can see on the right side of the screen where the traditional separation of these chapters into the J, or now called non-P by many scholars, and the P versions is separate. If you glance at the sections on the left side for chapter 7, you can see there's a bunch of skipping around there, that 7, 10, and 12, and then 16b to 20 is J, and that implies, of course, that the other verses are P, which is on the other page. I don't want to focus on that so much today. I want to focus on the experience of the story and what the authors are not telling us. Because a couple of episodes ago, when we started this section, I provided a chart with some of the cultural expressions of the Noah and the flood story throughout history, especially currently. And so much of it was about this story is like a kid's story, with Noah looking like a Santa Claus with a big beard and kind of a big belly, with animals and kids and a rainbow around him, like it was all something happy. And if we read these verses we're going to look at today from 11 to 16, it doesn't do anything to dissuade us of that. That we hear who gets in the ark and all that. But the story's not telling us something, so I want to do something that gets us to that. So to get us there, let's look at this picture for a second, which is a screenshot of what happens if you search, as I did, for the sounds of rain or storms on YouTube. And you see a whole list of videos there that have all kinds of storm sounds that are designed to help you fall asleep, like listening to rain and thunder, and that top one, which is 2.5 hours of thunderstorm on the ocean, is meant to help people relax. And maybe that would help you relax if you were listening to it from the comfort of your own home and it was just a sound in the background. But here's a little clip from the Darren Aronofsky film Noah that might give us a different perspective on that. One of the things I hope you can see from that film clip is not only the enormity of it, of taking as visually literally as possible the description we heard in verse 7 of the fountains of the great deep burst open and the windows of the heaven were open, but also the suffering that is left out of this story. The suffering both of the people who are scrambling desperately to get on the ark, who were portrayed earlier in the film as bad guys, as violent, crusading, marauding bands of savages, fitting the description that we saw of the earth filled with violence, but also of Noah fighting to keep them out of the ark. And his realizing that this is not going to be the peaceful scene that we see in our story here, like they all just entered nice and peacefully, with everybody else just quietly drowning with no screaming or complaints, but rather it would be the understandable struggles for survival. Perhaps a flip side of what we often see in dystopian post-apocalyptic films, where the elite are in their safe, protected zones, protected from the massive hordes of starving, hungry, or desperate people down below somewhere or outside. Here it's Noah and the animals in their ark, and everybody else on the planet desperately struggling to survive, but not for long, because as you could see in that clip, they were quickly drowned. So Part of what I want to get at here is one of the themes that I looked at the very beginning is the character of Noah as we go through here. In these verses, there's not a lot of detail about language or background that is important, although there are a couple of things I want to draw attention to. But mostly the tone and the character and why the authors are leaving some of this out. Because in other places we hear about the suffering, we hear about, at least anticipated, that when the day of the Lord comes, people will complain and suffer and gnaw their tongues and all kinds of terrible experiences of suffering, but we don't hear a word about that here. So with that in mind, let's go back to what we were looking at with the structure options, and then we'll enter briefly into our passage today. So we can follow today one of the three patterns, and if you've been looking at previous videos, you know there were two chiastic patterns, this one from Wenham above, and then the section from Casuto in the middle, seeing this as a series of paragraphs, which pretty much matches what we're going to do today, and then this chiastic pattern, which I've adapted from other scholars here, and we're going to be looking at this E section here, 7:11 to 16. And we're also to be continuing to pay attention to how the way this story is framed echoes elements of the Mesopotamian stories, in particular the Gilgamesh Tablet 11, which is only one of three options for Mesopotamian stories that this story is using as a base to counter it. And again, we'll look more at the end when I do a summary conclusion about these theological contrasts and what the authors are trying to accomplish in telling a story that's taking on elements of the culture around them in Babylonian exile, but changing that substantially. So we'll see, for example, today the exact date of the flood, which echoes Gilgamesh 11, and also the specification of the length here and the animals coming in without coercion, as well as the closing of the entrance of it. So those are elements of that we'll see here. And while I have verse 11 up there, you can see that it includes words that we wouldn't otherwise hear, fountains and windows. And I put windows at 8:2, but windows, of course, is here at 7:11 as well. It's found in only those two places in the flood story elsewhere, and it's not found elsewhere in Genesis. So let's look at that together now, just focusing on these elements. So the 600th year of Noah's life, again specifying it. This is echoing verse 6, and we showed last time that there's a little chiasm linking 7:6 to 7:11 around this 600 years of Noah's life. But this extends beyond that into the second month, the 17th day of the month, a very P-like thing, as scholars often say, that this detail of time is important to the priestly mentality who are responsible for organizing calendars of rituals and celebrations and things. And in the post-biblical era, the question of calendar control is one that was really important in reinterpreting passages like this in Genesis, especially in the non-biblical book of Jubilees, and also in 1st Enoch, but especially in Jubilees, where calendar control is an important thing. We're not going to focus on that now, but we'll see later in 8:13 that when the flood is over, it tells us exactly how long it's been, and that's part of P's message here. So we'll look at that when we get there. So on this very specified day, emphasized by on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. All. And so the word for fountain here, again, is uniquely a word in the flood story. Great deep is not this special term to home, rabbah, as Westerman notes, a fixed phrase. It occurs only in poetry, and you can see that it's used in Isaiah 51:10, Amos 7:4, and the Psalm as an expression. It's almost a mythological phrase. The Hebrew tahom here is echoing Tiamat from Enuma Elish, the primal ocean goddess, the saltwater goddess, from which all life comes in the Enuma Elish, and that was an issue in Genesis 1, where the Spirit of God hovers over the tahom, as you can see in my note below in chapter 1, verse 2. But this is the first time we're seeing it again here in 7:11 and in 8:2, and only once more at the very end of Genesis. But as a phrase, it's expressing the power of the Creator God or the Yahweh God, depending upon whether you want to see Elohim or Yahweh as originally separate that are joined, or simply two names of the same reality, as in conflict or combat with the great deep. And so that fits in with what many scholars refer to as the combat myth, that God's power is in combat with some other power. Although Genesis 1 does not present it that way. There's no devil, there's no opposing force. But we see that a number of times, not so much as the devil, but as ocean or chaos. So God is creating control over the earth by ordering things into their places, and here doing the exact opposite. Bursting it all apart, breaking it all down, and washing it all away so it can start over. The word for windows here is also rare in Genesis, only here, but you see it in a few other places. In the biblical text, you see it in 2 Kings there and Isaiah 24. And again, as Westermann notes, the cosmic dimensions of the flood do not occur again until the apocalyptic, which is what Isaiah 24 is part of, so-called little apocalypse in Isaiah 24 to 27, with a number of images and uses of language that we'd see common to Daniel and Revelation and other texts like that. So this is not apocalyptic in the sense of there's no veil being lifted to show the other side, if you will, the angelic heavenly realm. This is simply the realm of where the sky opens up and brings forth rain. And as my opening image noted, despite the fact that one can listen to the sound of rain and have that be a pleasant sound, it doesn't take much for us to know whether that's Hurricane Katrina or other hurricanes or major rainstorms without hurricanes, that lots of rain can fall in a short time and cause all kinds of havoc and destruction, let alone one that goes on for 40 days and 40 nights. We've noted before, and I'm just reminding us of it here, the 40 days, 40 is a pregnancy number, a time of conception. So like the Israelites in the wilderness between Egypt and the Promised Land for 40 years, it's literally, of course, 40 weeks at a time of pregnancy, but 40 becomes a symbolic number in the Bible for moving from one condition into a brand new condition. And so at the end of the flood, of course, humanity's in a new relationship with God, with one another, with animals, and with the earth, as we'll see in chapter 9. So with the fountains open, fountains burst forth, and the windows open, and the rain falling on that very same day, underscoring that Noah with his sons Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his son entered the ark, they and every wild animal of every kind, and we see it all in the stately procession. They went in 2 by 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God commanded him, and Yahweh shut him in. And so again, we have to wonder about some things that are being left out here. What about all the other animals? This is just a pair, or depending upon what you're reading, 7 pairs of the unclean animals and 1 pair of all the other animals. I'm sorry, 7 pairs of the clean animals and 1 pair of all the others, depending upon whether we're reading the J version or the P version that we've already looked at. But what about all the other animals? As we know, animals in the face of water would run or fly or crawl or swim or whatever they could do to get away from it. So in addition to all the humans that you see in the film clip struggling to get on that ark and Noah having to fight them off, all the other animals presumably would be doing something similar if they understood that there was safety there, or at least stampeding wildly all around. And in other words, there'd be a lot more chaos than the story indicates. This stately image here of everything just steadily entering into the ark while the rain falls, and Yahweh very gently shutting them in, or shutting him in, as it says, belies the fact that there are some major moral questions here. What about Noah's decision to do all this? Is that a good thing or not? What about God's decision to do all this? If we understand that whether it's as Elohim or as Yahweh, notice in verse 16, both are named. So whatever original sources there are, whoever's edited this in a place has not hesitated to interweave them a lot more closely than some commentators in the modern world would be comfortable with. So God commanded and Yahweh shut him in, as if those were 2 separate things. But of course, as readers, we understand there's only one God here. So this fulfillment of God's command and God's shutting them in, what about everybody else? Do we dare as readers challenge God's morality in this story? And if that makes us shudder, we'll recognize a few chapters later that's exactly what Abraham's going to do in the parallel story with the destruction of Sodom. And in that story, as I'm sure many readers already know, or viewers of this video already know, Yahweh is convinced by Abraham to relent if there's as few as 10 innocent people. But there's no test here to see if there's anybody innocent out there, despite the fact that Yahweh's search found that Noah is the only Tzaddik, the only righteous person in that generation. Is there really nobody else worth saving? Are everybody else's sins so bad that they deserve the death penalty without any kind of hearing? In other words, this flood goes against everything else that Yahweh tells people about how to render justice, to allow for witnesses and hearings and evidence, not in the American sense of constitutional due process, but in the biblical sense of not assuming that people are guilty of things unless you know it for sure, unless you give them a chance to speak. That isn't just based on the Constitution. That's much more ancient than that. And there are many stories in the Bible that illustrate that in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. But none of that here. No witnesses, no chance for a hearing. And no screams, none of the physical reality of what that suffering would sound like, apart from the perhaps quiet and still philosophical grounding of an ethical argument. There's a simple sheer terror that people would experience that's not being noted here. So I don't want to belabor that point, but I do want, as we go through this, to have a pause point and we consider what the authors of this story, whether you think of that as J or non-P or P or the redactor, or whoever we think put the story together, had in mind by presenting this act that God commands of mass destruction and that Noah carries out without a single question or complaint. Because in the next scene we'll see everything with the breath of life in it that isn't in the ark dies. See you next time.